Right, hello, welcome back to yet another revision stream. So, yesterday what we did was we covered theme 3 of Britain Transformed, and we began to look at changes in class, basically how, there was a bit of a decline of the upper class, but politically not really. There were changes with the middle class, things like fuller employment, the ability to own housing, and then we looked at all the changes for the working class, which is honestly quite a lot. I mean, you had things like the impact of World War One, World War Two, the unions, and then the limitations as well. So this has been probably about a quarter of theme 3 covered. Let's go cover another quarter today and look at the liberal society. I like the liberal society because it is mainly just a lot of acts that you need to remember. That wasn't all the liberal society was, but it was this idea of things becoming more permissive, and the acts definitely contributed to that. There's this guy here, Roy Jenkins, and that is... So if you got asked in an exam... to what extent was there a liberal society? He would be like one of your paragraphs, Roy Jenkins. Oh, I'm going to get rid of this too, because I don't need that. Roy Jenkins. He was a Labour MP, and he passed a lot of the legislation. For example, a couple I can name off the top of my head, things like the Family Planning Act, Obscene Publications Act, the Murder Act, I think it's literally called the Abortion Act, and there was one on, I think it might have literally been called the Sexual Offences Act, and that was about homosexuality. Let's have a look. Yeah, Sexual Offences Act. So, let's cover the impact of his legislation, and remember, you don't need to know every single one of these. It would be good if you could, but you really don't need to. You need to know a handful, obviously, to talk about. So let's cover a handful. Let's cover 5. Firstly, obscene publications. The Murder Act. Sexual Offences Act. What else? The Abortion Act. And what other one should we do? Oh, the Divorce Reform Act. That's a good one. So those are like the main acts of the liberal society that you want to focus on. Obviously, this would be an overarching point to a paragraph, If your other argument was talking about, I don't know actually, what other factors will there be for a reason for a liberal society? Guess one of your counter arguments would be the opponents of a liberal society. And maybe another one would be the impact of World War II, talking about how that led to it and not so much the legislation. But anyways, I'll go over the ones that I know the best. Murder Act is making it so that the death penalty is abolished. Now, with some of these, they are somewhat accepted, some of them aren't. This is an act which is not accepted at all, which is surprising now you think about it, but back then, the death penalty was so normalised, and obviously there will be reasons for people to want a death penalty, I'm pretty sure a couple of months or years after the Murder Act, there was a massively controversial case where people believed that this person deserved a death penalty, but obviously you couldn't get it. So it says specifically here, the majority of the British public remained in favour, but a lot of MPs had been convinced because there was a massive campaign. So the idea that the public were in support of death penalty, but politicians, MPs, obviously had a different reason. You know, they wanted to abolish it because of campaigns. So that's a limitation of the Murder Act. Right away, if you're talking about the impact, how far, to what extent was there a liberal society, you could talk clearly there about how public support for the death penalty was, you know, still very high despite the Murder Act. Another controversial act was the Sex Offences Act. This was meant to decriminalise soliciting of, I'm pretty sure it's just soliciting of, what would it be? Homosexual acts in private. So they called it soliciting when all it was, you know, them being in public because, you know, God forbid gay people exist. So decriminalise homosexual acts in private. Support grew because many saw being gay as an illness. That's an important limitation right there. So actually this act was well supported, but its intentions were different to the reason people would want it to be supported. People supported it because they thought being gay was an illness. Which would obviously take away from a lot of it. Also, the biggest limitation is the idea that the idea of soliciting homosexuality meant doing it in public, you know, literally being gay in public, and the limitation there is actually a lot of people were arrested. So there were more arrests as a result of that, instead of less. So you were allowed to be gay in private, but not in public, which led to further arrests. So again, a lot of limitations. The Abortion Act is obviously legalising abortions. A limitation of the Abortion Act, right away, is this idea that people... Well, it was enacted mainly because of the actual deaths that were caused of, you know, dodgy backstreet abortions. The focus was more on the deaths caused by those abortions instead of, you know, the actual moral issue. So abortion was legalized, but they put a heavy focus on deaths in order to swing the public around. And it was provided by the NHS, so you could link that to welfare if you want. This links to the changing status of women overall, which is a key one to talk about. And I'm back. Apologies. So, as I was saying, we were on. Oh my god. I've had COVID. We were on the idea of the changing status of women. The idea that both of these acts here encapsulate the Abortion Act and the Divorce Reform Act, which, off the top of my head, I believe that this act makes it so that it kind of gives more leeway to. Oh, come on. It's so obvious. It gives more leeway to being able to divorce. Which I think led to a massive surge of divorces. But let me just have a look. There'll be a nice explanation here. Yeah, allowed couples to divorce after they've been separated. A marriage could be ended. Oh, so it was this idea that you could end a marriage if there had been a fault, basically. So again, I wouldn't talk too much about this in an exam, purely because I wouldn't be able to word it right. But in an exam, if you get asked a question like, oh, the changing status of women, was significant, talk about the Abortion Act, talk about the Divorce Reform Act, then we'll talk a little bit about the limitations of it. But also, the Obscene Publications Act allowed serious works of art to use words and imagery, but it was limited. So, works of art using obscene, so things like sex primarily, but then this was moved to films in 1977. So that's a limitation because it wasn't originally introduced. So, liberal society. So, a big limitation of a liberal society is the idea that the people, many didn't want change. It was actually the MPs that pushed for the liberal society, these liberal laws. Often these laws were the result of long campaigns that had existed. So, for example, homosexuality had been an issue for literally 70 years at that point. These laws went against the views of the British public. The majority of people remained in favour of capital punishment, and support in the 60s grew due to the Moors murders. So that was what I was on about earlier. That's an important thing to mention. The idea that these people had killed people in violent ways, and yet they couldn't be executed for it. The laws were passed due to the impractical consequences. So it was a focus on the consequences rather than moral issues. So, for example, with the Abortion Act, a focus on deaths instead of the moral issue of abortion. There was a big idea that there was a sexual culture, when in reality there really wasn't, in an extent. I think a key point you really need to focus on there is that. You need to heavily focus on the idea of the sexual revolution was kind of sensationalized by the media. The Profumo scandal led to a greater growth of rumors. It damaged the reputation of Macmillan's government, forcing him to resign. So what you want to say about the Profumo scandal? This scandal led to greater reduced deference, less respect for these high-up individuals, and it damages politically, there wasn't much of a decline in the upper class, politically. For example, Macmillan's government contained a lot of this new upper class, people focused on wealth instead of ancestry. Well, the Profumo scandal actually shook this up a little because it reduces the deference, similar to how the rise of satire did. In the case of Macmillan's government, it forced him to resign. So, evidence for a permissive society. World War II undermined traditional values, promoting sex outside of marriages and encouraging divorce. So, divorces peaked in 1947. This idea that there had been World War II undermines traditional values. A number of post-war books helped promote more liberal attitudes. Obscene publications and the Theatre Act allowed more content to be published. People became far more tolerant of sex before marriage. I don't really think that would be something to fully write about. Mass observation reports show that women who had wartime affairs saw themselves as products of difficult circumstances and returned to their husbands after the war. So that's a thing to mention. Yeah, divorce peaked, but then it went down after 47. So highlighting limitations to this liberal permissive era. The idea that the sexual revolution had massively been, over sensationalized. Which is a very good term to include. The idea that most women were married and that the average age for married women fell down, so people were getting married faster. And finally, opponents of a liberal society. This is mainly going to be White House. So this is, I think her name's Mary Whitehouse? Yeah. Mary Whitehouse. An opponent of the liberal society. She formed the NVALA, that's a fucking annoying name. So this is basically what I call the Family Guy law, because it actually opposed sex, violence, and swearing on TV. So that's actually a very easy way to remember it. They had about 100k members, which is quite a lot. But they did have some success. So, for example, the 1981 Indecent Displays Act. So they did have some success, yeah. But overall, its limitation, its limitation was very, minimal overall. And the other supporters of, the other kind of opponents of a liberal society was this idea that a lot of people heard about a sexual revolution but didn't experience it themselves. The idea that the Moore murders happened, so people thought, oh my god, they're unmarried, that must be a connection. So actually the Moore's murders did do that. And sensational stories of upper class behaviour created a moral panic. So, that is everything. Now it's moving on to the women's topic, which we could go over today, or we could wrap up there for today. Obviously, I'm going to be live later. I am. I'm going to have something to eat and get sorted later. and then I'm going to crack on, and I will either cover more history, we'll go through the US boom and bust, or we'll go over women and race relations just for tomorrow, just to make sure that we have a lot to talk about. So yeah.